You're lying in bed at 2 in the morning, and your mind won't stop. Not because you're anxious about tomorrow, not because something happened today, but because you saw something in a conversation 12 hours ago that no one else caught. A flicker behind someone's eyes, a sentence that contradicted everything their body was saying, a silence that carried more information than the words around it, and your brain is still turning it over, still assembling what it means, still processing layers of a moment that everyone else forgot the second it passed. The worst part isn't the sleeplessness. The worst part is knowing that tomorrow you'll walk into another room full of people and it will happen again. You'll perceive things you didn't ask to perceive. You'll understand dynamics no one's discussing. You'll feel the emotional architecture of every interaction pressing against your consciousness like a frequency only you can hear. And you'll smile and nod and pretend you're only experiencing what everyone else is experiencing. Because the alternative, admitting how much you actually see, makes people uncomfortable in ways you learned long ago to avoid. Jung spent years studying people who carried this specific kind of weight. Not people who were overthinking or catastrophizing. Not people with clinical anxiety or obsessive patterns. People whose consciousness operated at a bandwidth so much wider than average that ordinary life became an exercise in constant, quiet overwhelm. He recognized that what looked like sensitivity or neuroticism from the outside was something fundamentally different from the inside. These people weren't feeling too much, they were perceiving too much. And no one, not their families, not their friends, not even most therapists, understood the difference. Today, I'm going to walk you through what Jung discovered about the real burden of heightened awareness, why this particular kind of consciousness creates suffering that's almost impossible to explain to people who don't share it, what happens inside the psyche of someone who can't stop seeing, and why Jung believed this burden, despite everything it costs, carries something essential that the world desperately needs but rarely honors. There's a distinction Jung drew early in his work that most people miss, and it changes everything about how you understand what's happening to you if you carry this weight. The distinction is between sensitivity and awareness. The modern world collapses these into one category. If you're affected by things others aren't affected by, you're sensitive. If social situations drain you, you're sensitive. If you perceive undercurrents and hidden dynamics, you're sensitive. One word, one label, one box that flattens an enormous range of experience into something manageable and dismissible. But Jung saw two entirely different mechanisms operating. Sensitivity is about reactivity, how strongly your nervous system responds to stimuli. Awareness is about perception, how much information your consciousness actually takes in and processes. You can be sensitive without being deeply aware. You feel things intensely but don't necessarily understand why or what's generating them. And you can be aware without being particularly sensitive. You perceive everything clearly but aren't emotionally shattered by what you see. The people Jung found most burdened were the ones who had both, high perception and high reactivity operating simultaneously. They didn't just see more than others, they felt every layer of what they saw. Every contradiction registered not just as information, but as a kind of friction in their nervous system. Every performance they saw through didn't just get filed away. It created a low-grade tension between what was being presented and what they knew was real. And that tension never fully resolved because new interactions kept generating new layers of it, every day, in every room, with every person. Jung recognized this combination as genuinely rare, and he recognized something else that his colleagues at the time refused to consider. These people weren't disordered. Their perception was accurate. Their awareness was functional. What was dysfunctional was the world's complete inability to accommodate or even acknowledge that some people are simply perceiving more of reality than others. The burden wasn't the awareness itself. The burden was carrying it alone, in a world that insisted the extra layers they perceived didn't exist. Think about what that actually means in practice. You're sitting at a dinner table with friends. Everyone's laughing. The conversation is light. And you're simultaneously tracking that one person at the table is performing happiness to cover something that's falling apart in their life. You can see it in the way their laughter arrives half a second late, the way their eyes don't match their mouth, the way they keep steering the conversation away from certain topics with a precision that's invisible to everyone except you. You're also registering that two people at the table have an unspoken tension between them, something that happened that neither has addressed, and it's creating a subtle gravitational pull on every exchange they have. You're aware that the host is anxious about something they haven't mentioned, and their generosity tonight is partly compensation for guilt they're carrying. You're perceiving all of this while trying to eat dinner, while trying to be present, while trying to participate in the surface conversation that everyone else is having without any of these additional channels running in the background. And if you mentioned any of what you're seeing, people would look at you like you'd lost your mind. Or they'd get defensive. Or they'd accuse you of projecting. Because for them, none of these layers are visible. The dinner is just dinner. The laughter is just laughter. The conversation is just conversation. This is what Jung meant when he talked about the isolation of expanded consciousness. It isn't that you're smarter or better or more evolved. It's that you're processing a fundamentally larger slice of reality than the people around you, and there's no shared language for the difference. You can't point to it. You can't prove it in the moment. You can only live inside the gap between what you're experiencing and what everyone else seems to be experiencing. And that gap is where the burden lives. Jung would have called this a form of psychological loneliness that has nothing to do with being alone. You can be surrounded by people who love you, people who genuinely care, and still feel this particular kind of isolation, because the issue isn't connection, it's comprehension. They can't see what you see, not because they're inferior, because their consciousness is calibrated differently, and you can't unsee what you see. Not because you're obsessive, because once perception opens, it doesn't close on command. One of the heaviest aspects of this burden is something Jung explored extensively, but that rarely gets discussed plainly: the exhaustion of constant translation. When your awareness takes in 3 layers of every interaction, you're perpetually doing mental work that no one around you realizes is happening. You're translating between what's being said and what's being meant, between what's being performed and what's being felt, between the conscious narrative someone's presenting and the unconscious pattern you can see driving it. This translation runs in the background of every conversation, every meeting, every family gathering, every casual exchange at the grocery store, and it's not optional. That's what people who don't carry this burden can't grasp. You're not choosing to analyze. You're not deciding to look deeper. The perception is automatic. It's like asking someone with perfect pitch to stop hearing when a note is flat. They can't. Their auditory system registers the information whether they want it to or not. Your psychological system registers the information whether you want it to or not. And the processing demands of that constant, involuntary perception are enormous. This is why people with heightened awareness need solitude in amounts that seem excessive to others. It's not introversion in the conventional sense. It's not that social interaction is unpleasant. It's that social interaction requires processing capacity that most people never have to spend, and after enough hours of it, the system is genuinely depleted. You need silence not because you dislike people, but because silence is the only environment where your awareness isn't being fed constant new material to process. Silence is recovery, and without enough of it, the burden becomes physically unbearable. Headaches, insomnia, immune system collapse, a kind of cognitive fog that descends when the processing system has been overloaded for too long. Jung documented this pattern across dozens of patients and noticed something consistent. Almost every one of them had been told, repeatedly, that something was wrong with them, that they were too much, too intense, too serious, too deep, too complicated, and they'd internalized this feedback. They believed their awareness was a defect. They spent enormous energy trying to dull it, through substances, through distraction, through forcing themselves into social patterns that depleted them, through performing a version of normalcy that contradicted everything their consciousness was actually doing. What Jung saw was tragic. People with a genuinely expanded capacity for understanding reality were systematically destroying that capacity because the world kept telling them it was broken. They weren't broken. They were carrying equipment that no one around them had, in a culture that didn't have a framework for what that equipment did. It's as if someone could see ultraviolet light and everyone around them insisted ultraviolet didn't exist. After enough years of that, you start trying to damage your own eyes just to see what everyone else sees. Just to fit. Just to stop being the one who perceives what others don't. There's another dimension to this burden that Jung found particularly painful to witness, and it's the dimension of premature knowledge. When you perceive at the level these people perceive, you often understand where things are heading long before they arrive. You see the early fractures in a relationship that won't collapse for another year. You recognize the self-destructive pattern in someone's behavior months before the consequences materialize. You sense the trajectory of a situation, a friendship, a workplace, a family system, with a clarity that feels almost cruel because you have to live with that knowledge while everyone else proceeds as though the ground beneath them is solid. This creates impossible emotional terrain. You know something painful is coming. You can see it gathering like weather on a horizon that only you can see. Do you say something? In most cases, Jung found, saying something accomplishes nothing except making you the target. People don't want to hear that their relationship is failing when they're still in the honeymoon phase. They don't want to know that the colleague they trust is operating from a pattern that will eventually betray them. They don't want the information your awareness is providing because that information threatens the comfortable narrative they're living inside. So you stay quiet, and you watch. And you carry the weight of knowing while performing the lightness of not knowing. Because that's the only way to maintain your relationships with people who aren't ready for what you see. Jung found this weight accumulated over years into something that looked, from the outside, like cynicism or emotional withdrawal. People would describe these highly aware individuals as detached, guarded, hard to reach. But what Jung recognized was that they weren't withdrawing from connection. They were exhausted by the gap between what they perceived and what they could express. They'd learned through painful experience that sharing what they saw usually ended badly. Defensiveness, accusation, dismissal, or that particular look that says, "You're making this up." So they pulled the visible part of themselves back, not because they didn't care, because they cared too much to keep subjecting themselves to the pain of being disbelieved about their own experience of reality. And if you carry this kind of awareness, you know that pain intimately. The specific ache of seeing something clearly, knowing you're right, and having no way to convey it that won't cost you the relationship. The particular loneliness of being the only person in the room who noticed what just happened. The fatigue of decades spent managing the distance between your inner perception and your outer expression, holding the gap closed by sheer force of will so that you can function in a world calibrated for people who perceive less. If any of this resonates with what you've been carrying, you might find something useful in our guide, True Self-Discovery. 24 reflection exercises drawn from Jung's own methods for turning inward with honesty instead of judgment. It's designed for exactly this kind of inner work, the kind that most resources skip over because it's too uncomfortable to sell. Click below to get True Self-Discovery. Now let's keep going, because there's something Jung discovered about this burden that changes how you relate to it entirely. Jung spent a long time studying what happened to people who tried to solve this burden by reducing their awareness, by numbing it, by forcing themselves into smaller perceptual spaces. And what he found was consistent and disturbing. It didn't work. Every attempt to shrink awareness to fit the world's expectations created psychological symptoms that were worse than the burden itself. Some developed depression, not the sadness kind, but the flatness kind. The kind that comes from systematically suppressing a core function of your psyche. Their consciousness wanted to perceive, and they were spending all their energy holding it back, and the result was a gray, muted existence that felt like living behind glass. Everything was visible, but nothing was touchable. They could see life happening but couldn't feel connected to it because the very faculty that connected them, their awareness, was the thing they were trying to shut down. Others developed anxiety that seemed to have no source. Jung understood this as the psyche's protest against being caged. Awareness that isn't allowed to operate consciously doesn't disappear. It goes underground. It starts firing in the background without direction or context, generating a constant sense that something is wrong without providing any specific information about what. The person feels perpetually on edge but can't identify why, because the perceptual system that would normally provide the why has been forcibly disconnected from conscious processing. Still others developed what Jung described as a false self so thick it became suffocating. They built an entire personality around being normal, easy, uncomplicated. They learned to laugh at the right moments and stay silent at the right moments, and never ever reveal the depth of what they were actually perceiving. And this performance worked socially. People found them pleasant, agreeable, low maintenance. But internally, the distance between who they were performing and who they actually were became a kind of slow-motion psychological fracture. They were living as a character in their own life, and the real person, the aware one, the perceiving one, the one who saw everything, was locked in a room with no windows, screaming into silence. Jung was adamant about this. You cannot solve the burden of awareness by destroying awareness. The faculty is part of you. It developed for reasons. It functions because your psyche is built to operate at this bandwidth. Trying to reduce it is like trying to make your heart beat slower by sheer willpower. You might suppress the surface expression temporarily, but the underlying system will rebel, and the rebellion will be worse than what you were trying to avoid. So what did Jung actually propose? Not elimination of awareness, not even management of awareness in the way self-help culture typically frames it, tips and tricks and coping mechanisms that treat the perception as a problem to be contained. Jung proposed something more radical and more difficult, a complete reorientation of your relationship to what you perceive. The first part of this reorientation is what Jung described as accepting the separateness, and this might be the hardest thing he ever asked of anyone. He meant accepting, at a bone-deep level, that you will never experience reality the way most people do, that the gap between your perception and theirs is permanent, that no amount of explaining will fully bridge it, that you will always see layers others are blind to, always sense what isn't being said, always recognize patterns before they become visible, and that this difference isn't a temporary condition to be fixed, it's the actual structure of your consciousness. Most people with heightened awareness spend years, sometimes decades, resisting this acceptance. They keep trying to make others understand. They keep searching for the right words, the right framework, the right moment when someone will finally say, "Oh, I see what you mean." And occasionally someone does. But mostly, the attempt to be understood becomes another source of exhaustion, another way the burden compounds itself. Because the energy spent trying to translate your experience into terms others can grasp is energy diverted from actually living with your experience in a way that's sustainable. When people finally accepted the separateness, really accepted it, not as resignation but as structural truth, something shifted. The constant low-grade strain of trying to bridge the unbridgeable relaxed. They stopped needing everyone to see what they saw. They stopped measuring the validity of their perception against other people's agreement. They let their awareness be what it was, their own, private, accurate, and not requiring external confirmation. This didn't make the burden disappear, but it changed the burden's weight. It went from the weight of carrying awareness plus the weight of trying to be understood to just the weight of carrying awareness. And that reduction, Jung observed, was often enough to transform the experience from unbearable to merely heavy. Merely heavy was something people could work with. The second part of the reorientation involved what Jung would have called purposeful deployment. Instead of awareness being a constant flood, every interaction at full bandwidth, every room scanned to maximum depth, every person read across all available layers, Jung taught people to develop the capacity to direct their perception intentionally. Not to shut it off, because that doesn't work, but to choose where to aim it and how deeply to engage with what it reveals. This is subtle and easily misunderstood, so let me be precise. Jung wasn't suggesting that you can stop perceiving. He was suggesting that you can stop processing every perception to its deepest layer in real time. You walk into a room and your awareness registers everything: the tensions, the dynamics, the performances, the undercurrents. That registration is automatic and permanent. But the deep processing, the assembling of what it all means, the extrapolation of where it's heading, the full integration of every layer, That can be conscious. You can register without immediately processing. You can perceive without immediately interpreting. You can notice without immediately engaging. This is a skill, not a switch. It develops over time, and it requires something that most highly aware people resist: the willingness to let some perceptions go unexamined, to see something and choose not to pursue what it means, to register a contradiction and decide that this particular contradiction doesn't need your energy right now, to perceive a pattern and trust that if it matters, it will present itself again when you have the capacity to engage with it. People who developed this capacity described it as the difference between drowning and swimming. The water is the same, the depth is the same, but instead of being pulled under by every current, they learned to move through the water with some degree of choice about which currents to follow and which to let pass. The third piece of Jung's framework was perhaps the most counterintuitive, and it's the one that most people with heightened awareness resist the hardest. He insisted that the burden of awareness is not just a personal cross to bear. It's a function. It serves something. Not in the hollow, spiritual bypassing sense of everything happens for a reason. In the structural sense that consciousness at this bandwidth exists in the human species because it performs a role that narrower consciousness cannot. Jung observed that throughout history, the people who carried this burden were the ones who saw what was coming before it arrived, who recognized dysfunction in systems before the systems collapsed, who perceived the shadow in leaders before the shadow consumed them, who understood the undercurrents of their communities with enough accuracy to serve as early warning systems for dangers that no one else could detect yet. This didn't make the burden lighter, but it gave it context. It meant that the exhaustion and isolation weren't pointless. The perception that set these people apart from everyone around them wasn't a glitch. It was a capacity the larger human system needed, even when it didn't know how to honor or protect the people who carried it. Jung was honest about the paradox in this. The very quality that makes heightened awareness valuable to the collective is the quality that makes it devastating to the individual. Society benefits from people who can see what others miss, but it rarely protects or supports those people. It benefits from their perception while simultaneously punishing them for having it, calling them too intense, too serious, too difficult, too much. And this is where Jung's thinking gets genuinely challenging, because he didn't offer a resolution to this paradox. He didn't promise that if you just do enough inner work, the burden lifts. He acknowledged that some weight is permanent, that consciousness at this level comes with costs that don't fully resolve, that the isolation of expanded perception is a structural feature of the experience, not a bug to be fixed. What he offered instead was something harder and more honest than resolution: integration. Learning to carry the weight not as a wound, but as a defining quality of your existence. Not pretending it doesn't hurt, not performing peace you don't feel, but finding a way to inhabit your awareness fully, including its costs, without being destroyed by it. Building a life that accounts for what you need: the solitude, the depth of connection with the rare people who can meet you where you are, the creative or intellectual outlets that let your perception express itself instead of festering in silence. Integration, in Jung's framework, doesn't mean the burden becomes light. It means you become strong enough, rooted enough, honest enough with yourself about what you are, to carry it without breaking. And paradoxically, that strength often comes not from adding anything, but from stopping the things that make the burden heavier than it needs to be. Stopping the performance of normalcy, stopping the desperate attempts to be understood, stopping the self-betrayal of pretending you don't see what you see. Every pretense you drop reduces the weight, not because the awareness changes, but because you're no longer carrying the awareness and the disguise simultaneously. Jung noticed something else in the people who reached this integration. A quietness settled into them that wasn't numbness or withdrawal. It was the stillness of someone who has stopped fighting their own nature. They still saw everything. They still perceived the layers, the contradictions, the trajectories. But they'd stopped treating their perception as a problem. They'd stopped apologizing for the space they needed. They'd stopped shrinking themselves to fit rooms that were too small for what they carried. And in that stopping, something open that had been closed for as long as they could remember, a sense that their awareness, for all its weight, was fundamentally theirs. Not a curse inflicted on them, not a disorder to be managed, theirs, part of the fabric of who they are. And that ownership, quiet, private, unannounced, is what Jung considered the real turning point. Not when the burden lifts, because it doesn't fully lift, but when the person carrying it stops wishing they were someone else, stops envying the people who move through life perceiving only the surface, stops believing that less awareness would make them happier, and starts recognizing that their particular consciousness, with all its costs, is also the source of everything they value most about themselves: their depth, their understanding, their ability to be present with people in ways that most humans simply cannot. The burden doesn't become a gift. Jung was too honest to frame it that way. It remains heavy. It remains isolating. It remains exhausting in ways that no amount of integration fully resolves. But it becomes yours, fully, unapologetically, structurally yours. And there's a difference between carrying something that you believe shouldn't be there and carrying something you've accepted as part of the architecture of your life. The first is agony. The second is still difficult, but it's a difficulty you've chosen to inhabit rather than flee from. And that choice, quiet as it is what Jung would have called the beginning of real psychological freedom. Not freedom from the burden, freedom within it. If you're sitting with this right now, recognizing the weight of what you carry in these words, the true self-discovery guide might be worth your time. 24 exercises rooted in Jung's approach to honest self-examination. Not the kind that tells you to think positive, but the kind that helps you face what's actually there. Click below to get true self-discovery.